Chapter 22. The Second Petal. Michael stood over Sam and Julia's bodies. As Sam lay dying on the floor from the gunshot wound to the neck, his eyes glazed over with a dark tar-like substance. The blackness circulated like ink in water, never still, always flowing. Though the flower was bringing him back to life, this was not Sam awakening, but Malice. He rose to his feet like a scene from a Dracula movie, rigid and stiff. The dust and crushed sheetrock and concrete left a cloud of smoke that undulated through the air behind his half-cocked head. A dark black and purple glow engulfed his body and whipped around like a gasoline fire. Michael was scared. He knew this was not Sam, and he hadn't felt fear like this since Ra. The power that Malice was wielding at this point was tremendous. It began to radiate from him in a flaming black brilliance. Malice was not good, and it was almost palpable. The amount of will that he possessed at this point was enough to invoke nausea and vomiting to everyone within 50 feet of him. The soldier that shot him in the neck was no exception. He quickly dropped to his knees and yacked his guts out. Sam held out his hand, and the soldier lifted off of the ground and shot across the room. His neck landed directly in Malice's palm. Effortlessly, he squeezed until the soldier's head and body fell lifeless to the floor, separated from one another. "Calm down, Sam," Michael barked.
"Sam is hiding in his box,"
growled Malice.
"I respect your power, Michael, but if you don't leave, I'm going to kill you."
"You can't kill me, Malice." The monster cranked his head over to look at Michael. He glared at him for a brief moment and wasted no words. With a simple wave of his hand, he sent the angel rocketing out of the building, breaking down every wall in his path. Michael was outmatched and outclassed. Malice ascended to a far more powerful state than Ismail or Ra was at this point. The sheer amount of hatred that circulated through his veins was a driving force in his strength, and that strength was manipulated by the resurrection. There was no one else with any kind of power that would be able to step in and stop him now. Michael did not have what it took. He was going to have to let this monster have his way. Malice giggled cynically for a moment. He was ready to unleash hell, and he had the power to do it. With a deep breath and a powerful squat, he launched himself up to the many floors above him and rocketed out of the top of the building. At the apex of his jump, Malice surveyed the city below him. He saw how full of ignorantly blind people it was, walking around like sheep without a shepherd, silently judging one another with deceitful contempt. Oh, how he longed to slaughter them, to destroy those that had created him. Such a waste of air they were. They needed to pay for their existence, and Malice was about to collect on that payment. As he raced back towards the rooftop, he raised his hands above his head, both fists clutched. Upon contact with the roof, he smashed them down with a deafening impact. A thunderous crack followed. A boom erupted from the building as its very foundation exploded out from underneath it. The shrapnel from the explosion shredded the flesh of dozens of people at street level, breaking bone and tearing bodies in half with lethal and brutal force. The building creaked and groaned and popped as it came crumbling down. Dust filled the air for blocks. Screams were heard from inside and outside of the surrounding buildings. Beyond the screams and car alarms, there was an eerie silence. Malice stood atop the mound of steel and stone with a sickening shit-eating grin. To Malice, this was barely even a warm-up. The hundreds of dead and mutilated bodies in the rubble were nothing compared to what he intended to do. He needed to slaughter them all. Everyone needed to die. He picked up a truck-sized piece of concrete from the rubble of the building and hurled it like a frisbee towards the building across the crumpled and broken street. This inhuman task was effortless. The impact caused a large portion of the building to collapse. Malice wasted no time. He could see the people inside of their homes, scared and running for their lives. He waited for them to come flowing out of the front door in panicked masses, and as they did, he raced into the center of the crowd, knocking those in his way down like bowling pins made of sand. The blood from their eviscerated bodies covered the mass of panicked people and only caused the screaming to intensify. Those closest to the center tried to run, but it was pointless. Malice began grabbing them and ripping them apart. In a dizzying flurry of body parts and blood, he shredded through dozens of people without a second thought. As they began to run, Malice raised his hand and beckoned them back to him. They would simply be pulled off of their feet and fly backwards into his grip like a human yo-yo. It was in Malice's hands they would die, before they even knew what happened. No one who came out of that door survived. Malice stood in the center of the shredded pile of dead or dying people, saturated in blood. Some were writhing in agony. Others were twitching as the nervous system sent its last impulses of electricity. He breathed in deeply through his nose with a sense of pleasure, much the same way one enjoys a bouquet of great wine. He reveled in the smell of blood, but this would not be the end. There was still so much more to do. This place needed to look like the hell he was from. There was no ash or cinder in the air. The smell of burning flesh and sulfur did not singe his nose hairs. He needed to change that. Hell needs fire, and now he was all warmed up. He was going to give this place the makeover it needed. Stepping over broken and dismembered carcasses in his way, Malice casually walked out into the middle of what used to be a street. A single swish of his hand would push away all the dust in the air and send all of the debris and busted cars tumbling away from him. With another gesture, the asphalt cracked and floated up away from the ground, leaving only dirt and broken gas lines spewing massive amounts of noxious fume into the air. With but a thought, Malice created flame from the thin air and ignited the gas. The explosion was horrendous. It shattered windows for blocks and scorched the surface of every building that was in sight. Malice needed this. Carnage and chaos, misery and agony. His need to spill blood could not be satiated. He knew that men would come and try to destroy him. They would bring their guns and try to kill what they did not understand. If he listened close enough, he could hear the sound of tanks and armored vehicles making their way to combat what the media would later declare an unknown source of pure evil. A slight smirk gave but a glimpse into the excitement that was building inside of this monster. They would flock to him like lambs to the slaughter, and he would paint the streets red with their blood. The sounds of sirens and helicopters filled the air. First responders were gallantly racing to the scene to save lives and protect their beloved city. They were unaware of what they were charging into. When the first set of police, firemen, and paramedics showed up, they were overwhelmed by the carnage. It was difficult to know where to begin. There were so many dead that there was hardly anyone to save. The horror of the situation was nauseating. Malice waited for them to draw deep into his trap. The glow that surrounded him went away, and he simply went dormant to lure people closer to him. He struggled to contain his power and his rage until just the right moment. Motionless, he waited for their approach. A pair of firemen were the first in the vicinity. Assuming from the amount of blood that was on him, they needed to check out if he was all right. To them, he looked like a victim. Half burned and caked in blood and dust, they barraged him with questions. He did not answer. He did not move. They attempted to move him, though it would be the last mistake that they would ever make. Malice grabbed them both by the back of the head and collapsed their skulls together and threw their bodies away like useless rag dolls. Several policemen saw the two firefighters die and drew their weapon immediately. They began shouting at him to get on the ground. Another police officer turned and recognized him as the monster from the previous evening's slaughter. "That's him!" he shouted. "Shoot that bastard!" The small group of policemen quickly turned into a larger group, and they all began to fire at Malice. Each officer unloaded their entire clip on him. Not a single shot made it through. Each and every bullet stopped midair about 15 feet from him. Malice remained motionless. They had all advanced close enough to him. He was ready to spring his trap. The purple and black glow burst outward and began to undulate around him once again. The men and women closest to him instantly became nauseous, dropping to their knees, vomiting uncontrollably. Malice wasted no time. He darted towards the closest officer and punted him into a building over 300 feet away. The next officer was able to fight through the nausea and reload his firearm. He was also able to squeeze off 6 shots before the monster made his way to him. Malice was unfazed by the gunfire and squatted down in front of the kneeling officer.
Kill yourself,
Malice whispered to the officer with a deep growl. Without any hesitation, the officer pulled the gun up to his head and pulled the trigger. Killing each of these men one at a time was a bit too time-consuming for his liking. He needed more destruction, more death, more conflict. Waving his arms again, he sent every one of the remaining officers tumbling hundreds of feet away with tremendous force. The sound of armored vehicles drew ever closer. He could feel the fear of the soldiers and the glee of their commanders that were about to get the opportunity for combat. Malice became elated. He saw an opportunity to stretch his wings and put his amazing power to the test. He wanted a chance to show off how strong he had become. In his eyes, he was a god, and his wrath was mighty. He would instill fear in every last person. If he were going to turn this place into a hell, he would need a lot more death and destruction than this.